Hi guys, something I want to talk about today is what I call the Great Triangulation. To explain that term very briefly, it means to find a point, as if on a map. You find points around it to triangulate around and find, in this case, the reality of what sword fighting or historical European martial arts actually are or were to the people who wrote the manuals that we study. So the way it's usually used is to explain why we train in several different ways, or many different ways, with many different types of training tools in order to get to one sort of end point or understanding. For example, longsword combat. So we're studying, for example, say a 15th century treatise that deals with the use of the longsword. We're modern people in the modern day. We haven't had a medieval upbringing. We're not physically like medieval people. We don't walk generally as much as they do. We don't ride as much as some of them did. We don't necessarily grow up in our childhoods wrestling or eating the same kind of food. We don't have the same kind of life that they had, and equally we don't have the same understanding of martial arts that they had. They were living in a very different time, and the way that they saw these weapons was from a very different perspective to how we see them. So, you know, we come into historical European martial arts, or any martial art in fact, as modern, most of us Western people, if you're watching this this video, and therefore what we need to do to try and get into the mindset and understand the sources that we're studying is come at it from lots of different angles. So, for example, when a lot of people start training with longsword, they use something like this. Okay, so this is a waster. In this case, it's a nylon one made by the Knight Shop here in the UK. These are one of the most popular training weapons for longsword at the moment. They've been around for a few years now, about four years, something like that. And you know, they're about the right weight. They're the right balance. They look the right shape. But they are a bit safer than steel weapons because when they break, they don't stick in you and make a hole. They very rarely break, in fact. They're quite bendy, quite flexy. Some people argue too flexible, and there are different makes which are different stiffnesses. And you know, they're quite fat on the edge and so on. So they're fairly safe beginner training weapons. And in my club, in Schola Gladiatoria, you know, we use them as beginner weapons essentially. And they're also a good thing to get people into sparring. So that's the first thing to talk about, is that when you start studying the treatises, you've got a load of techniques laid out for you. However, once you've practiced these techniques over and over again, you get to a point where you have to pressure test these techniques. And that's when you enter the world of sparring, as it were, or some people like to call it free play, fencing, whatever term you prefer, it's the same thing at the end of the day. And obviously the reasons that we do free play or sparring is not 100% the same as the reasons that people say in the 15th or 16th century did sparring. So the way that it's the same is we're trying to test our skills. However, for our part, we're also trying to reconstruct a dead martial art, which means that not only are we testing our skills at fencing, but we're also, hopefully, trying to test our interpretation and understanding of the old treatises as well, and see if, you know, our interpretation of a certain technique actually stands up to pressure testing. So those sort of weapons are the first thing that come in, but then a lot of people quite rightly say, well, you know, it's not that like a sword, it doesn't move in exactly the same way, the weight's not distributed in exactly the same way, it's plastic, so it has a different vibration, it's a bit more floppy, and so on. It doesn't even sound the same, you know. So then a lot of people even skip the plastic weapons because they just don't like training with those, and go straight to what we call a Federschwert. In actual fact, there's almost no evidence for them being called Feders or Federschwert in the medieval or Renaissance period, but this is what they've been come to known as today. And as I've probably shown on other videos, or I'll talk about a bit more at some point, this is essentially the historically accurate practice weapon. Hope you can see all of this. And this is one made by Peter Reginier in Hungary, but you can get, there's different manufacturers that make them. And essentially it is to longsword what a foil is to a small sword. In other words, it's a sort of made safer for sparring. It's a bit lighter in the blade, it's a flexible blade, it has a blunt and rolled tip, obviously it has blunt edges, and a characteristic feature of the Feder is the flare dracasso, which I won't go into the details for why it's like that. But so this is a Federschwert. It's essentially the medieval Renaissance fencing sword version of a longsword. But again, this isn't exactly like a longsword, and that's very, very important to point out. So a lot of people go, plastic swords are rubbish, Feders, people should only spar with Feders. But then, at the end of the day, a Feder isn't exactly like a sharp sword either, because not only is the weight distribution a bit different, but it's flexible, which means that things happen in the bind somewhat differently, and it's blunt, okay? So, when we move on to the sharp sword, you've got sharp edges, you've got a very, very stiff blade that doesn't flex much, so it's actually, and usually they've got more weight in the blade as well than a Federschwert. So actually it moves a little bit differently, it feels a bit different in the hand, and if we were to clash blades for whatever reason, and I won't get into the topic of edge and flat at the moment, that's for a future video, if they bind against the edges or even obliquely, that will react very differently to how the blunt edges on a Feder or just a blunt sword are. And there's also some people who massively criticise the Federschwerts and say, people do everything with Feders these days and they should be using blunt swords because blunt swords are more like real swords, i.e. sharp swords. But in actual fact, the blunted swords that are not Feders, because they're stiff, for example, are still not like a real sharp sword, because they're blunt. And there are other reasons as well, but the basic reason is they're blunt. So essentially this is when we come back to what is triangulation. Triangulation is my attempt, or my group's attempt, and lots of other groups out there's attempt, to use many different tools to emphasise different aspects of our training so that we can get to a closer understanding of what it is to use an actual sharp sword. And the last element of that I'll talk about in this video is test cutting. Okay, so once you've learned how to use the sword, how to defend, how to attack, how to move around, the principles of fencing, maybe you've pressure tested your interpretation, something else to think about then is actually how does the sword fundamentally work at the most basic level, and that's where test cutting comes in. And I'm going to talk about test cutting a little more in a separate video, but test cutting is essentially using a sharp sword to test different objects, to test that your form and understanding of how to cut is correct. Thank you very much.